Welcome to the Power Panel podcast, a show where we follow the leadership journeys of exceptional African women at the helm of public service and civil society. Our question is, how do African women lead and deploy power? I am your host, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, a senior counsel, diplomat, and former cabinet minister in Kenya. It is 1989. The air is thick and heavy, with acrid plumes of black smoke. It stings the eyes, tickles the nose and throat. It is difficult to suppress the urge to cough. 12 tons of ivory tusks are burning, hundreds of them piled together in several pyramid-shaped mounds at the Nairobi National Park. They have been set alight by the President of Kenya. No one thought this was possible. Excited photographers and eager onlookers press forward to catch a glimpse of Kenya's first historic ivory burn. It is the brainchild of the famous Dr. Richard Leakey and constitutes a dramatic expression of Kenya's commitment to protecting elephants. Later, a Kenyan woman, an ecologist by training, a mentee of this great man, reflects on this astonishing event and says this.
One person came up with this wild idea, got the president of Kenya to come and burn this mountain of ivory. And as a result, the world started thinking about what was happening with ivory, what it meant to have ivory, and how leadership can, appear. And it was in that, I would say, that realization gave me a lot of confidence that I too could be a great leader by basically doing the most surprising and courageous acts.
Dr. Paula Kahumbu did become a leader in her own right. She's one of Africa's most acclaimed wildlife conservationists, as well as a celebrated author, filmmaker, and the CEO of WildlifeDirect. Her story is one of discovery, self-actualization, and the crystallization of a fierce passion for wildlife conservation in Africa, led by Africans and for Africans. She is feisty, courageous, outspoken, and imaginative. But who was Paula as a child?
If I look back to my childhood, I was very shy, very quiet. I had a very large family, and my siblings were very noisy, argumentative, always in fights, and I was the one who never got into any form of argument. And I always considered myself to be non-confrontational. And it wasn't until much later when somebody said to me, Paula, you can be really abrasive. Because sometimes I find myself in circles where I have to speak out. I just can't not speak out. You can't see injustices and just pretend they're not happening. But in some circles, it's just normal. And people don't see things until you show them. And then it's uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, which was why I got labeled abrasive. And I think the power of being able to give people these new eyes to see the problem of how conservation has been managed on the African continent for decades, hundreds of years even, it actually makes people sit back and think, what is the impact? What are the consequences of us continuing down this road? We know that more than 60% of our wild animals have already gone extinct. Something has to change.
Where did this fervor for wildlife come from?
I really, really cared about animals when I was young. We lived on a farm. We had all kinds of animals, and I was always with the animals. And I thought I would be a vet. And then I went off to help a vet one day at the vet school, and I saw, I guess it was an autopsy being done on my favorite cow. And I knew that was not going to be my life. There's no way I'm going to work on animals that are dying or dead. I wanted to be like Jane Goodall or Richard Leakey or Ian Douglas Hamilton, all these people who were doing these extraordinary things out in the wild, adventures. It looks so fun and amazing. And by the time I was in high school, I was spending a lot of time in libraries, reading books, and going on every field trip I could possibly go on. One of them at the age of 15 was an extraordinary opportunity. It wasn't meant for high school kids, it was meant for university kids, but the universities had closed down. So they came to high schools and they selected 10 students to go on a 1-month expedition to northern Kenya, to Turkana, marching for 1,000 kilometers in the desert, climbing mountains. Every child had something to do, and there were 10 students from the UK. They were all university students we were buddied up with them. My job was to collect insects or bugs in general, scorpions, spiders, butterflies, you name it, in the northern Kenyan deserts. And it was hot, it was unbearable. We almost died. We got attacked by lions. It was the best experience of my life. It was really one of those things that if my parents knew what they were signing off when they said she can go, they probably would have fretted. We were literally left as 15-year-olds to our own devices. 10 camels, 10 Kenyan students, 10 British students, wandering about in the desert with a map drawn by a very famous explorer, a Wilfred Thesiger, which literally said, walk for 2.5 days until you see an acacia tree, turn left, walk for another 3 days. It was those kinds of instructions. You wouldn't dream of doing that today.
Paula's adventure in northern Kenya stirs a passion in her for nature.
I was completely addicted to spending time out in nature. After high school, which was just a few years later, I was dispatched off to secretarial college like so many young girls in those days. And my good friend and I just ran away. We absconded. We ran away to the national museums. And we were just so blown away by the research that was going on in our country, in our parks, all by British scientists. So we went to Richard Leakey's office and I knocked on the door and I said, my mother is trying to force me to be a secretary, but I want to be a ranger. I had nothing, no money. I wasn't going to go to university. I thought that the way I would get back into nature was to be a ranger. And Richard Leakey let me in, sat me down, listened to my stories about what I wanted to be, what I wanted to do. And he basically took me under his wing and opened a lot of doors for me from then on.
And so Paula's professional association with Dr. Richard Leakey begins. This is no ordinary man. He's a Kenyan hero, an archaeologist, a conservationist, an author, writer, politician, public administrator, and public speaker. He is many things in one.
He was absolutely an extraordinary man. And when I knocked on his door, I wasn't overwhelmed by his greatness. Many people wouldn't have dared do it, but he also happened to be my neighbor. And so I knew of him coming and going in our neighborhood. And he reminded me that he met me when I was 5. And he met me walking around with my brother Dominic, and we had found a tree hyrax up in top of a big old Mbugua tree. And he had told us all about this animal. And we had spent a lot of time going to his house to learn about various animals. But working for him and actually, being kind of a mentee, at the same time a good friend of his, was extraordinary because by the time I was 26, so by then I had done my bachelor's, done my master's, I'd started my PhD, and I was hungry for Kenya to do more as a nation, to stand out in the world as a center of excellence in wildlife conservation. And Richard basically asked me to stopped my PhD in the middle, even though he was really all for education. He said, I want you to take off 1 year, come and work for me, run the national delegation for CITES, the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. And I was young. I think I was just in my early 30s. I had no idea about politics. I was a researcher. I wanted to spend my time in the forest with my notebooks and my binoculars. That was my dream world of where I was going with my career. He said to me, we need somebody who can really help pull together the national delegation. And the university gave me a break for a year. And I went off, I actually spent 2 years with him managing the national delegation, which was profound because one of the marks of Richard Leakey's leadership was that he would just give you enormous responsibility and say, get on with it. I trust you. And if I had problems, he would say, my door is open. Come and talk to me. Your appointment is 6 a.m. He came to the office at 5:30. So he really taught everyone about discipline, about being really persistent.
There is another trait about Dr. Leakey that impresses Paula.
And he was also the demonstration of something which is so unique that one person's view and commitment can actually transform everything. Richard Leakey is the person who dreamt up this wild idea of burning the ivory. Nobody thought it would even burn, but it was one of the most momentous events in all of conservation ever. He also did lots of things which never worked, but still having absolute conviction that one event could change the world and save an entire species from extinction.
Paula becomes a conservationist. It is an area of work in which African women often struggle to find legitimacy.
I would say probably one of the most important things that Richard said to me was, don't ever give up on your education. You must get that PhD. He was telling me that from the day I completed my bachelor's degree. He wrote me a letter, asked me to come and see him at the museums, and he said, you must get your PhD next. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a scientist. A lot of the legitimacy comes from having the academic credentials that people are going to take you seriously. So I think that's one thing, and I use that a lot, and I really encourage people that I interact with. Being a lay conservationist is not going to be enough really when the rubber hits the road. You need to really know what you're talking about. The other thing is the legitimacy in the sense of maintaining my stand, not being cowed into silence, not wavering on my commitment. But if things go wrong, if things don't work out the way I thought they were going to work out, if I make a mistake, coming clean about it. Richard Leakey was the first one to say, oh, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And I think that level of integrity is so important. We're not always going to win. We're not always going to succeed. But we have to acknowledge it and find another solution. We meet a lot of people who get into trouble wrongly, especially when it comes to the law. Sometimes one way to hold people back in many of these developing countries around the world is to threaten them with a political force or legal force or whatever. And some people never recover. I've noticed quite a few people never recover. I can't tell you how many times I've been told, you're going to be investigated. We are watching you. I've been called by various people from the police department. And I'm like, okay, great. I think you should really put your energies on something more important. But if you're watching me, well, great. I hope you find something. But I think that that legitimacy you're talking about comes from living a life where I know that no matter how much you look, you're not going to find something that is going to be a skeleton in my closet that prevents me from my full power. That has been so important to me. I've never given a bribe. I've never taken a bribe. Having that confidence that you can't get me on that, it's incredibly powerful. But it's one of those things that, it's a slippery slope. You can't pull yourself back from it.
So is integrity crucial for your leadership?
Absolutely.
As Paula supplements her qualifications and advances her career, she encounters prejudice.
I've experienced racism directly. When I was in Florida, I actually took someone to court and I won the case. Somebody who wouldn't give me accommodation because of the color of my skin. He was happy to rent me his accommodation when he heard my voice, but when he saw my face, things changed dramatically. And again, I think standing up to it is really important. Being the person who doesn't fear and also who won't just accept, what would I call it, that baseline that is the wrong baseline. Many of my colleagues at university said to me, what are you complaining about? It's always been like that. We all live on the other side of town. Why do you want to live on that side of town? Us dark-skinned people live on the other side. When I see those kinds of injustices, it's like a red flag to a bull.
Patriarchy also presents a challenge for Paula in her work, particularly the social-cultural inequalities that cloud the effectiveness of conservation efforts in some parts of Kenya.
So patriarchy is prevalent. I think it's everywhere. It really is everywhere. And sometimes what I find most difficult to deal with is when I hear people that I want to champion, communities, for example, and they say, you're challenging our culture, you're challenging our traditions. And I don't believe it's true at all. I see it a lot in Kenya, for example. Kenya is one of the few countries in Africa that has a very, very vibrant conservation movement. We have something like 270 conservancies, which are conservation areas owned and managed by local people and local landowners. Many of them are communities. And these are funded by the tens of millions of dollars every year by international donors. 97% of the beneficiaries are men. When I brought it up and I said, how can we, with all clear consciousness, call this community conservation when it's only men who are getting the benefits? And many of the people, including the women, said, don't touch it. This is our culture. Women are happy with where they are. Women are satisfied with having soft powers. Women don't need title deeds. After all, they're going to move to wherever their husbands take them. And it really is one of those things. It's one of the challenges that I'm facing right now. There's blame being put everywhere and red herrings being thrown in the mix. Things like all you're doing is trying to prevent us from getting international funding, or you want to make it look so bad that we have to invite hunters into Kenya. Well, it's got nothing to do with it. I'm asking you guys a simple question. This form of conservation won't survive much longer into the future because half of the population is not engaged.
Is the battle for inclusion integral to your leadership ethos?
Yes, absolutely. So inclusion is a huge part of my responsibility as a leader. Because of the work I've done and because of the recognition I've been getting, I'm often asked to speak or present on various platforms. And I often speak about several things. One is, the access, for example, for African filmmakers to participate in big international films that come to our continent. So the diversity of local peoples, the opportunities for training, the benefits sharing to the people where we are filming, and of course, access for women. I think a lot of people have said to me, it's happening, Paula, you don't have to be so pushy. Things are changing. It's like, it's not changing fast enough. It's not changing fast enough in my lifetime. And so I will take a stand and I will say, I will not sit on a panel, for example, an international panel. I will not sit on an international panel if I'm the only woman or if I'm the only person of color. I just won't do it. And I tell my colleagues to do the same. Some of them won't do it, but a lot of people are getting it, that we're not there as tokens. We're there because we have a contribution, a perspective, a voice, an opinion that matters and that needs to be heard.
Paula is not afraid of uttering uncomfortable truths. She uses her voice to challenge male domination in the conservation sector and their depictions of Africa's nature.
In conservation, for example, in the filmmaking in conservation is very clear that when it comes to who presents nature to the world's audiences, it's usually men and it's usually white men. There's a slight movement towards men of color and I think there are only 2 or 3 women of color who are now presenting for wildlife. About only 6% are women. The difference is this: white men, especially, or I would say men in general, they have a view of nature that is really looking for drama, excitement, danger. It's all about technology. If we talk about conservation, it's all about guns and helicopters. It's very hard and harsh, and there's a lot of weaponry involved. Because a lot of the conservation which is led by men, which is actually what a lot of the cameras are looking towards, is usually men in boots marching with guns or driving in big Land Rovers. A lot of the funding for conservation was very much aligned to that for a long time. A lot of male researchers, if you watch, the conservation groups, you'll see there's quite a lot of reporting whenever an elephant attacks a vehicle, a tourism vehicle or a research vehicle. It's usually a man driving a vehicle, getting far too close to an elephant that's in a particular state of mind called must, which is related to their sexual state. And I think that it's conveying the wrong message, or there are huge gaps in the messages.
Paula strongly believes that women experience and portray nature differently.
And when you see a film that is narrated by women, so I recently did a big series with National Geographic called Secrets of the Elephants, and there were a lot of women involved in the production. And it was more about, the secret lives of elephants. How do they think? How do they make decisions? How do they look after their families? How do they communicate with each other? What kind of innovations do these matriarchs have to come up with in order to survive in a changing world, whether it's because of urbanization or climate change? And I think that it brings out something very different. It's very soft. It's much more intellectual. It is not in your face. And I think it speaks much more to who we are as people. This different perspective onto nature, which is about our relationship to nature, our role as keepers, protectors, restorers, is something that is becoming much more important worldwide. It's linked to our mental health, our physical health, our bodily health. I'm seeing much more interest from people about this, and they want to know, well, how do humans relate to elephants? Sometimes they believe there's even a spiritual link. It's not even just science. They're definitely interacting with the environment around them, shaping it and organizing it and interacting with other animals. Women who study elephants tend to be people who don't just put radio collars on them and monitor them on a telephone or on their computer. They tend to be people who sit and watch the individual elephants and know them as individuals. And they know which elephant is associated with which other elephants in terms of their families, their friends, and what happens to them on a daily basis, what they're upset about, and how they might behave when it comes to a critical situation.
As we pause at the first signpost on Paula's journey, we observe two things: that passion fosters leadership and mentorship consolidates it.
There is growing concern about the future of Kenya's elephants and for the custodian of the country's wildlife, keeping the elephants safe.
In 2013, Paula soars to prominence through an ingenious and bold initiative to save Kenya's elephants. she launches an award-winning, internationally acclaimed campaign called Hands Off Our Elephants.
Wow. It was such an important campaign. We started this campaign because the world made a decision that we thought was going to be catastrophic. During one of the CITES conferences, it was agreed that China and Japan could buy ivory from 4 southern African countries. And we felt that this was going to unleash a poaching epidemic across the continent. And we saw it happening in Tanzania, and it was also beginning to happen in Kenya. And we could see it in the form of photographs of herds of elephants gunned down in Tsavo National Park. But the government at the time was saying, it's not so bad. It's all under control. It clearly wasn't under control. We had networks of people all across the country who were saying, this is getting really, really serious. So we started the campaign in order to mobilize public support for elephants. But we didn't do the campaign in a vacuum.
Paula elaborates on the strategies she uses to drive the campaign.
First, we actually spoke to people in the Ministry of Intelligence to find out what's happening with intelligence when people are gathering intelligence about ivory moving, because Kenya had become the #1 country for ivory trafficking. We wanted to know, how could this be happening? Where are the gaps? We wanted to know what's happening on the ranches and in the national parks. How are poachers getting access? What's happening in the courtrooms? How is it possible that poachers and traffickers and traders of ivory were not getting jailed or put behind bars for long amounts of time? So there was a lot of research that we did, and which revealed that the court system was broken. The fines and penalties were far too low. The system was rigged. People were having their evidence removed. They were having case files hidden and lost so that cases couldn't go all the way to trial, to completion. And the big wigs were never getting caught. And so Hands Off Our Elephants, we launched it because not enough was happening. The government was denying there was a problem. Different agencies were not working together. And really, international organizations were being called in to come and help. And we were like, no, this is our problem, and these are our elephants, and we are going to take it on ourselves. So this campaign mobilized thousands of people to march on the streets of Nairobi and demand action and justice for elephants. It was very appealing to see so many people join us on the streets. People would fly in from other countries around East Africa to join us. And then on the side rooms, we were having meetings with government. And we actually had a meeting with, at that time, it was called the National Economic and Social Council. And we presented our data. The Ministry of Wildlife and Tourism presented their data. And we were asked to come up with 13 recommendations, which were all approved and implemented. And that's why, at the end of the day, during that crisis, Kenya only lost 2,500 to 3,000 elephants out of a population of almost 40,000 elephants. Tanzania lost nearly 76% of all their elephants. They were the country with the largest population of elephants in Africa. And that was because in Tanzania, civil society wasn't able to mobilize, they weren't able to report or question or challenge their government. So there was a big difference. And so my strategy was really to employ the media, to get them all on board, to find out who in government could help us to reach the head of state so that he would make it his campaign. In the end, it was the First Lady who really stood out. She became the first lady in the world to take a stand on a wildlife issue like this. And then we also mobilized people and corporations. I spoke at so many different events, and we had, Safari Link plaster all their airplanes with stickers saying "Hands Off Our Elephants" and "There is no ivory on board." It was easy because the enemies were really clear. The enemies are poachers and traffickers. They are bad people. Nobody would deny that. And it led to some very, very important changes in the laws, the arrest and conviction of some of the biggest players at the time. And actually the ivory trafficking moved to other places. It moved down to Dar es Salaam, and some of it moved north into other parts of Africa. This was such an important campaign because what it did was it showed that Kenyans can do it. We don't need to wait for the big international organizations to come to us, to help us, to solve the problems for us, which was happening before that. We all have to work on it together because this is an international crisis. It's not just a Kenyan crisis. But actually this campaign translated into huge changes, and many organizations are still running as a result of Hands Off Our Elephants. They're still running campaigns, trainings, or lobbying for better legislation as a result of the work that we did at that time.
As she curated this campaign, did Paula feel powerful?
Yeah, it was amazing. I wouldn't say I felt powerful because I didn't have power in the traditional sense. Like I didn't have a pen that I could sign something, sign off or approve something. What I had was a very, very carefully planned campaign. I actually brought in experts to sit down with me. I can imagine myself in the middle of something where I've got the links to the judiciary here, links to the police there, links to KWS, links to central government. I had all these advisors who really wanted Kenya to stand out. So I had this group of people, it was my dream team really, that enabled me to deliver a campaign that has, I would say, really labeled me and labeled my organization actually since that time. And the power really was in seeing how all these things come together and really keeping everybody on board. I wish we could have done more. I still feel like we should have done more. We should have given, and we still should, to give even more protection to elephants and other animals. But at the time, it really stood out as a campaign that I guess gave Kenyans a real sense of agency. I mean, my own mother came when we did the ivory burn in Nairobi. She came with ivory trinkets that my father had given her 60 years before, because she was so moved by this idea that ivory is no longer something to be proud of. It's something that is just covered in blood. People still call me till this day saying, I feel so ashamed. I've got this thing in the cupboard. I've hidden it, but I need to get it out of my house. It's giving the wrong energy to my life. I've got to get it out of here. Where can I take it? So in a way, yes, it is power, but it's a different kind of power than what we're used to seeing, which is a government position or some role of sitting on a pile of massive amount of funds or something. It's influence.
Like her mentor, Paula unleashed the power of ideas. She awakened unprecedented citizen participation in wildlife conservation through an imaginative event driven by her unwavering passion and the clarity of her vision. She led, and people followed. As we take this short power break, we ask that you subscribe to the Power Panel podcast. Let's work together to expand the Power Panel community. Visit our website, birdsongafrica.com, and follow us on social media to plug into the Power Panel network. Email your thoughts to hello@birdsongafrica.com. When we return, we unveil the next stage of this journey. This is the Power Panel podcast. Paula has creatively transitioned her efforts into new spaces with a specific focus on the empowerment of African women and girls.
So my work has moved much more towards two key areas. One is conservation education, and the other one is documentaries and films to drive our conservation messaging, awareness and action. And we deal with women along that entire spectrum. So, for example, When I produce Wildlife Warriors, which has become an award-winning TV series in this country and around the world, I make sure that every season has as many women, if not more, than men. We actually create a subliminal message in everyone's mind that women are at the front line and they're doing amazing things. They're not trying to replace men. They're doing very different things. Some of them are business people, some of them are scientists, veterinarians, all kinds of interesting careers, and they're all contributing to conservation. And the subliminal message is that it is men and women, whereas the traditional films about conservation are usually men in charge, men running parks, men driving vehicles, men flying aircraft, men with guns marching and catching poachers. So that's a big part of it.
Her educational work is underpinned by the desire to train a new generation of African conservationists.
The other part in education, I would say, is really critical. So we've produced a series with Disney called Team Sayari. And it's an actual behavior change campaign around nature and conservation. The series features children presenting nature from 5 African countries. And so the children who are presenting, half of them are girls, half of them are boys. And the series is shown in schools across East Africa. It's dubbed in Swahili and Kenya, Rwanda. And we make sure that in the screenings, in every single screening, there's at least 50% girls who are participating in those screenings and activities that go along with the whole program. We identify girls who really stand out.
Like many leaders who rise to prominence, Paula finds that demands and expectations burgeon.
I've come to the conclusion that I can't do everything. And I was beginning to feel very ADHD-ish because there's so much to do. And I have to keep like carving my path and saying, I can't do everything. I'm going to carve that out. I'm going to focus on this. And so one of the things I've been doing is supporting young women who are standout leaders in conservation. I still do support boys, but I'm on the hunt for girls, for young women who will become the future leaders of conservation. Part of what I believe we need to do is to instill integrity from a very early age, because I can see a lot of women in this sector and in many sectors in this country who are swayed, they are silenced, they don't question certain things which we should always be questioning. They don't get that we have an equal right to equity. We have an equal right to same salary, same promotions. We have an equal right to the kinds of jobs that we get. And I feel like my role can be that I really instill this in young women and raise a generation of powerful young women in the sector. You know, women you're not going to mess around with. Because in conservation, many of the women they may be technically brilliant, but they're not going to go head to head with men in a room. We've been raised in a certain way. And I think about my mother, who was a real champion for women. She still gave my brothers the kind of jobs that she would never give us girls. And it used to drive me insane. When I was a kid, I used to get so upset. My job was to sweep and clean and cook, and their job was to fix everything, the lights. And I really hate it now because I'm terrified of electricity, you know. And I want to create a world where from a very, very early age, we remove that stigma and we really create an opportunity for girls to have agency, where they don't just have the skills, but they also have the opportunity to use those skills effectively. That's really where I see I can make a difference.
Paula is a woman of many talents. She has a knack for storytelling and, to her surprise, becomes a celebrated author of a children's book. What is this book and why does she write it?
Do you know, as a scientist and somebody who really took the science very seriously, I could see from even before I finished my PhD, nobody was going to read my PhD. Nobody was going to take any notice of the recommendations that I was making. And most of the science that is done in this country and around the world never gets to see the light of day in policy and decision-making rooms. The storytelling angle came when I wrote the book Owen and Mazay together with a child in New York and her father. That book was one of those things that somebody else was pushing me to do. I didn't really want to do it. I didn't even see a future in it. That book was an instant hit. A simple story. I was just telling the truth. This hippopotamus was a victim of the tsunami. He gets rescued by us, brought to a center where he makes friends with a giant tortoise. And these two animals become best buddies. And the survival of the hippo would not have been possible without the tortoise. Cute story. When I published it, my professor at Princeton, the first thing he said is, what the heck are you doing? You're a scientist. And I said, because you know what? It has moved. It's been read by millions of people. In its first year, we sold over 1 million copies. That's a book, a little book. And what people were telling me is this story is telling me something about myself. It's telling me in Kenya, many children said, it's telling us that children should listen to their elders. In America, they were saying we should take care of children who are orphaned. Their friends could come from the most surprising places. People from California told me that God was speaking to them through the stories of these two animals. People have a way of interpreting a simple story that's true, but they will interpret it to make sense in their own lives.
This little influential book catches the attention of Dr. Leakey, and with his wise counsel, Paula uncovers the nexus between conservation fundraising and storytelling.
Richard Leakey actually called me and he said to me, just tell me this story again, because initially it was a blog. It wasn't a book. It was a blog. Before we had blogs, they were called weblogs. And we had 500,000 people reading our blog. And he kept coming saying, tell me, how come so many people are interested in this story? I was like, I don't know. But, it probably had a lot to do with the fact that there was so much suffering during the tsunami. And that's when he made me an offer to come and work for him at WildlifeDirect. He said, bring your storytelling skills to conservation. And Richard Leakey was the person who made me see the possibility. He said, imagine if those 500,000 people just gave you $1 each. Imagine how much money you could bring into conservation. And so my first job at WildlifeDirect was to find stories. Across the African continent, we ended up with 120 organizations who were sharing their stories via our platform. And we were raising huge amounts of money for conservation. So that's why I started. And what I came to realize is that weblogs, they ran their thing and they all fizzled out. But film, especially as I started telling more stories in the film sector, was very interesting because our voices were not being heard.
At this second signpost, we observe that Paula is multifaceted and resourceful. She merges her intellectual knowledge and her courage with her natural creativity to devise fresh approaches to wildlife conservation. We learn that exemplary leadership can be fueled by invention and daring. The wildlife conservation film industry is often accused of harboring a culture of exclusion. Paula is determined to carve out space for Africans in this sector and explains why.
People would ask me questions, get all the information. They would never pay a cent. And then you'd hear some presenter from England speaking your words. And I couldn't get the films back because they told me there were legal reasons why these films were not going to be available in Africa. My first thing was, we need those films in Africa because we need to educate people. So I said, then I'm going to make my own films. And it really was thanks to Linus Kaikai at Nation, who gave me over a lunch. We basically shook hands that we would do an experiment and we would see if the Kenyan public really did care enough. And we started a TV series called NTV Wild Talk. And do you know, Rachel, today, 8 years later, that series is still running on that channel. The only nature series produced by Africans running on any African channel. So I think that Animal stories are just amazing because everyone cares and everyone is curious about nature. But if you think about it, our scientific capital has been extracted from our country for so long, so much knowledge in our traditions, in our cultures, among our people, among our young scientists, among our rangers and KWS. And so there is this untapped source of phenomenal stories that I realized we have to start telling those stories. When I started, I was the only one. Now I have over 1,000 filmmakers on one WhatsApp group who only do nature storytelling, and that's all they're interested in. And it's just so exciting, the amount of creativity, the insane level of interest and excitement, the kind of stories that are being told through animation, through drama, through documentaries. It's just so exciting. And you say I look young, it's because I work in such an exciting field. And so bringing these two worlds together, I believe it will not just unleash massive amount of new stories, new ideas, and I would say interest and excitement among our people, but it's also going to, I would say it's going to regenerate the economy in conservation. Because if you sit on a piece of land with a family of warthogs, they might look like a really irrelevant animal, but actually the stories of warthogs or dung beetles, butterflies, they're fascinating. And you can make no end of number of stories about those animals as individuals, as characters.
As Paula works with African filmmakers, storytellers, and adventurers, I wonder to what extent they have succeeded in altering the classical image of an explorer in Africa. That picture of a bearded, male, non-African person wearing a safari hat, discovering and explaining Africa's nature to Africans.
We're definitely turning the dial, but let me tell you, there is so much resistance. It's quite frustrating. I won't say that my job is done. You know, I've been on the board of National Geographic, so I can tell you the resistance is real. The resistance to the idea that an explorer looks anything other than what we've been seeing for the last 100 years. And so the amount of attention, which is really measured in how much money is being given to explorers from Africa versus other parts of the world, it's very clear. We're not seeing Africans being positioned as world leaders of issues. They may be positioned as African leaders or Zimbabwean leaders. You know what I mean? We've got to get out of the space of, I'm going to sit within someone else's platform and fight for my visibility within that platform. That's not going to work. We now need to do something so transformational that we create our own platforms. That's really, I think, where we have to go next with this. We need our own platforms, which are going to be globally recognized.
Agitating for wildlife conservation is an endless road, requiring large amounts of energy and commitment. It also exacts a personal cost.
It's I have to say, you're right. There are days when it's, things seem really challenging. I've had so many challenges with authorities in this country. They don't like to be told when things are not going right. They don't like to be told that something they're doing is going to have a negative impact, it's going to look bad. And they can be very mean and they can punish you and they can threaten everyone around you as well. I mean, I've had my own family saying, stop doing things, like you're going to get into trouble, you're going to get hurt, it's going to impact on us, our children are going to be affected.
Does she feel afraid?
I don't feel afraid of the poachers and the cartels. I would say, there was a day when I got a call from a certain police station warning me and threatening me. And it came from one of the ministries. And I was annoyed and a little bit afraid somebody was probably watching me and I had to go and get security advice. I'm more concerned about that. But I think my anger turns me into somebody who's not afraid but energizes me. When I see something that's not going right, it energizes me to look for ways of addressing these challenges. And you know what really excites me, Rachel? Every single problem there was out there, I would get a call. Paula, there's people taking baobab trees. Come down to Kilifi, help us. It was literally down to the single tree. And I realized that I had failed everyone because it all depended on me being able to go out there and fight all these fights. Even people who had treated me so badly in the past would call me and say, we need your help now because this and this and this has happened. And I realized I have to let go of that anger and empower people with information. Like, it shouldn't be a secret. How do you campaign to stop things from happening? Or how do you campaign to bring new laws into place? So I was so thrilled the other day when I saw mamas protesting on the streets in Karen to save Ololua forest, and demanding that the grabbers of the forest, who must have been very powerful people, that they get arrested. And it worked. There's a whole group of people who call themselves hands off trees. So I guess my answer to that thing of are you afraid? I'm not afraid anymore, because there are so many thousands of people who care and who are active, who are doing things, who will take risks, who are taking the march to the streets themselves. I just advise people. I might give them a phone number. I might give them some tips, but I don't need to be out there at the front of every march anymore.
Paula has dedicated her life's work to the ever-pressing task of conserving wildlife in Kenya and across our continent. She has done so in novel ways. Looking back in time, what would Paula say to her 5-year-old self? What is her power mantra?
I guess the word trust comes to mind. Trust yourself. Trust yourself. You will be able to take on whatever challenge you face. It's always surprised me that despite how impossible sometimes things feel at the time, we can get through them. And that 5-year-old girl who wanted to stay invisible and actually stay in the forest and study elephants and never be seen by human beings, my commitment to conservation made it impossible for me to just stay in the forest and stay with the animals. We're always making choices, and I've never looked back and said, I really regret this or the other thing. I wish I could be cloned, because I feel like there's a lot that still needs to be done. I have cloned myself in that there are so many people out there who are doing what I started.
As we conclude Paula's story, we pose this question. How does one know when their leadership has been transformational? It is when, through one's ideas and efforts, other people become leaders themselves and stand in strength on the values one has imparted. Paula learnt from her mentor about making a difference in our world and grew to develop her own vision and purpose. Through her voice and bravery, she too inspires a new generation of young Africans to appreciate the precious heritage we have in our wildlife and our enduring obligation to conserve it for posterity. We thank Dr. Paula Kahumbu for sharing her inspiring leadership story with us, and we wish her well as her journey continues. We thank you most sincerely for listening and look forward to your company on our next episode. This is the Power Panel Podcast.